Welcome back once again for another Agatha Christie Hercule Poirot mystery review. I've been in either a prolific reading burst or a huge reading slump, depending on how you feel about Agatha Christie. Okay, not really though. If you prefer my other types of reviews, don't fret, because I have actually read some other nonfiction and more literary fiction books, so I do have a few of those up my sleeve right now, but some of them have just taken me a little bit longer to prepare than I originally anticipated. I don't even know what order these are going to come out in anyway, but I think there'll probably end up being quite a few of these Agatha Christie ones in a row. So after the funeral, also I'm definitely not filming this in the middle of the night, despite how dark it is. It's actually 5 in the afternoon, but daylight savings expiration or whatever. So after the funeral, in the Poirot chronology, this one follows Mrs. McGinty's dead, which wasn't really one of my favorite Poirot novels, though it had some points of interest. For me, though, I'd say the past few Poirot novels have all really been misses. Back until The Hollow and Five Little Pigs, both of which I'd say were above average Poirot novels. But getting to the present work, After the Funeral was a mystery that I'd place overall around the middle in a ranking of Christie's Poirot novels, because in some regards it stands out, but in others I found it really lacking. This is a really solid mystery plot, and in that regard I'd place it above average. It's tighter and therefore easier to follow, without too many frivolous red herrings. There are red herrings, of course, but they're used sparingly in a way that I think makes them a lot more effective here. And it feels like the reader has a fair shot at solving it, which I say because I did solve this one and piece together most of the relevant clues. The overall scenario is also more interesting than it first seems. The idea of beginning a murder investigation at a funeral feels at first a bit underwhelming, but then the events that follow this give this scenario a bit more uncertainty and force us to consider a wider variety of different possibilities. And I couldn't say more about that without spoiling anything, but I'm not going to until the explicitly spoiler-filled section, because I think this dimension is best enjoyed while discovering it for yourself. Where the novel fell short was in its characters and setting, which were probably among the most boring I've seen in a Poirot novel. The first hour or so of this book is a litany of lifeless character introductions, including many of whom we'll be seeing again as suspects throughout the novel, and others of which we'll hardly ever see again, though at the time there won't really be a great means of judging which ones are which, and none of these character sketches are vivid or eccentric enough that they'll give you a whole lot to remember. No, the beginning of this novel was just so dull that I very nearly stopped listening and saved it for later, thinking, I'm just not in the mood for this right now. I will say that I believe if you have the physical copy of the book instead of listening to it as I did, there's a family tree in the front, which, although it doesn't add any life to boring characters, will at least help you keep track of which characters are related or married or siblings or cousins or aunts and uncles. But it does actually get better as soon as the investigation starts, even a little bit in terms of characters. And certainly by about a third of the way into the book, the novel does begin to shine in its own way. But yeah, the character introductions were on par with Hercule Poirot's Christmas, one of the first Poirot novels I reviewed on this channel, and one in which I had a similar experience at the beginning, but in that case, it didn't really get any better. This setting doesn't offer much to grab our attention either. Most of the novel simply takes place in nondescript sitting rooms as our investigators speak with the relatives of the deceased. So there you have it. If you're interested in a good whodunit, I'd place this one higher on your list, but if you're interested more in a novel that is fun to read even without trying to solve the mystery, go for something like The Hollow or even Taken at the Flood instead. Taken at the Flood was one where the mystery was subpar and the characters ultimately kind of disappointed by the end, but at least in that one the post-war setting really came through in a way that gave certain life to the novel that we just don't see in the same way in After the Funeral. Okay, so let's get to the spoilers now. Maybe a bit earlier in this review than usual, but given that most of the things that I have to say about the novel relate to the mystery itself this time, that's just how it's going to have to be. If you're still wanting to read this one and solve it for yourself, see ya. So as I mentioned, I figured out the murderer in this one and pretty much the general scenario that took place. I think in some regards this may have been easier here than it often is because there weren't a lot of suspects that really fit the bill. So it really might come down to whether you were seriously thinking about this character among your list of suspects in the first place. Let's step back just a bit first and consider the overall setup of the novel. Dead man, we're at his funeral, relative mentions he was murdered, and everyone sort of implicitly acknowledges this is very possible. Seems like the setup for a typical post-mortem investigation that we see in this type of novel, especially once the woman who suggested this possibility turns up dead the very next day, implying that she probably knew too much for her own good. We then get some of the usual blundering suggestions from the other detectives on the scene of the second murder, Cora's murder, suggesting that her murder must have been a break-in, a burglary. These suggestions are so painfully inept that we see right through them. Obviously, there is a connection between Cora's death and the implied murder of Richard. But if we're not careful here, and at this time I really wasn't at first, we might go a step too far and conclude that she was murdered because what she said had been true. If we fall for this bait too hard, we could very easily remain confused for the rest of the novel. Because fundamentally, there are two realms of possibilities here. Either Richard Abernathy was murdered, and then Cora was probably speaking on some genuine knowledge, or he wasn't actually murdered, he died a natural death, and Cora was just pulling this suggestion out of thin air. But then someone saw it advantageous to make it look like it was right, that he really was murdered. Now, there may be a wide realm of possibilities for why someone might want to make Richard's death look like murder, even if it wasn't, maybe to frame someone. But one prominent possibility is that they actually wanted to kill Cora and make it look like she was silenced for speaking out, which is indeed exactly what happened here. Of course, as we eventually learn, there's an additional twist, which is that this wasn't just an idea that came to one of Cora's relatives upon hearing this suggestion. This was an idea planted by Cora, who herself was not even the real Cora, but an imposter. For me, this actually all works out really nicely as a mystery plot. And if you're considering this possibility that the killer actually primarily intended to remove Cora and not Richard, then it's not that this possibility is explicitly more likely than that Richard was the primary target and Cora was being silenced, but as sort of comes out in the investigations, and as Hercule Poirot and his little gray cells seem to also conclude, there's just not that much evidence favoring the latter explanation, that Richard Abernathy was murdered. By contrast, there is a potential motive for the other explanation of Cora being the primary target, and this comes out towards the middle of the narrative. I think other astute readers may pick up on this too, even if you were a little bit misled at first, and it's that the mention of Cora's art collection when visiting her residence is really too conspicuous to be dismissed as mere decoration, especially in a novel as colorless as this one in terms of actual setting and character description. If Cora was killed, it could very well have been to snatch one of her art pieces that she didn't realize was valuable. And who inherits these art pieces? Well, the murderer, of course. Now, at what point did it become clear to me that Cora had not even been the one to show up at Richard Abernathy's funeral? I'm not so sure about that. The late-breaking discussion of mirrors and the attempted murder of Helen, the one person who could have recognized the real Cora, may have solidified this suggestion in my mind, but I think I also had observed a bit earlier that basically everything we knew about Cora, and by extension about these implications of murder, was coming right from her housemate, meaning without any corroboration. It was completely unreliable, if the housekeeper is unreliable. So it seemed totally plausible that everything about this had been fabricated as a ruse to get rid of Cora. But that, of course, would have required someone other than Cora herself to be present at the funeral to plant the initial suggestion, which was also a real possibility, given that no one knew her. One more piece of evidence that could either be misleading or leading, depending on how you considered it, was the self-poisoning by the murderer. I liked how the police mentioned at the end that this actually tipped them off to be suspicious of her because they claimed self-poisoning by arsenic was a common tactic. And in fact, I can think of at least one other Agatha Christie novel where something similar happens. I won't say anything more just to avoid spoiling that one if you haven't read it yet. This poisoning scene is definitely a clue to the reader though, but maybe for different reasons. I think the fact that someone in that scene is so bold as to suggest that a common way of murdering someone like Cora would be to send her a box of poisoned chocolates, and then immediately after that, a piece of wedding cake shows up from some random stranger. Like, why isn't this arrival regarded with total suspicion after such a conversation? Certainly the readers will know instantly that eating this wedding cake would be a really bad idea. And yes, this wedding cake could have been sent by anyone. But based on our point of view in the narration, we can be pretty sure it didn't come from Susan, because she seems, at this point, kind of to be ruled out as the poisoner. She's pretty surprised. And a likely candidate at this point is, strangely enough, the poison victim herself, because she could have been there to deliver it. So summing up the whole mystery plot itself, I found this one pretty strong, even if I'm maybe a bit biased since I figured it out. But I really don't think I have to figure it out for me to really like the mystery plot. I just think this one was not at all a bad scenario. The misdirection in who was murdered versus just died was actually really clever in hindsight, although it took me a while to figure this out, which I think was a sign of being well planned and well executed. In particular here, a trap was laid for the readers of two strongly opposing the foolish police officers who assumed there could be no connection between Cora's death and what she said about Richard Abernathy, since it turns out then that there is a connection, but only because the idea was intentionally planted there. There were a few clues, like the direction of Cora's head tilt, that made some sense if you were already on the right track, but maybe not so much sense if you weren't. It might seem just a little bit out there. And then, as for the other characters, they were mostly forgettable. Mr. Entwistle, the solicitor, was a little interesting at the beginning, even as a potential suspect himself, but that possibility, I think, kind of fades away before too long, since it just doesn't really add up, making him end up more as a sidekick in the investigation. Timothy and Maud, boring, and not really featured all that much. Rosamund and Michael, boring. Susan and Gregory both brought at least a little bit more life. Susan because we got to follow her a bit longer, and Gregory as sort of a tormented soul character. Yeah, Gregory was kind of interesting. I felt bad for him because I think by today's medical standards, he might easily have been helped with psychotherapy, but at the time, his guilt complex or punishment complex might just really not have been very understandable, including to many in the medical community. He does end up kind of being more of an oddity in the end than a character truly portrayed as really sympathetic, but I definitely found him more compelling than some of the others in spite of the limited attention he receives in this novel. Overall, though, a pretty dull bunch of folks in the Abernathy family and close acquaintances, but not enough to ruin my fun of solving the crime. So what did you think about this one? Did you guess what was going on? Did you buy it when it was revealed? Do you agree with me that the characters and setting were generally weaker overall than some of the stronger Poirot novels? Let me know, and as always, stay tuned for some more Agatha Christie and lots of other reviews coming before too long. Bye, and happy reading.